Hey everybody, welcome to Loco Profiling episode 9. Now initially I was going to just do a video on Great Western number 9466, which is my favorite Pannier tank engine. But because this is actually the last positive review that I'm going to make, well, not positive review, but the last positive video that I'm going to make, I decided to have it expanded into a top 5 list of the most unique Great Western tank engines in general. Not just Pannier tanks, but also, just side tanks and saddle tanks and whatever. So, yeah. Hope you'll enjoy this one.
Number 5. Number 4600. Now, just because you're unique, that doesn't make you useful. A 442 Atlantic, Locomotive 4600 could be seen as the prototype for a supposed new class or possible family of locomotives. The Small Atlantic Tanks. Not an official nickname, but it does fit really well, considering this engine was a downsized take on the idea of the 2221 class locomotives, which were large Atlantic tanks, based on the original Great Western Counties, the 3800 class 440s. Designed by the GWR's revolutionary guru, George Jackson Churchward, who also designed number 4600 and the 2221s. And yes, those 440s were the original Great Western Counties, which were all designed, built, operated, retired, and scrapped long before Charles Collett could take the 3800 numbering sequence and use it on his take of the Churchward 2800 class consolidations, and long before Frederick Hawksworth could use the county name on his 1000 class 10-wheelers. So, yeah, there you have that. As for number 4600, the engine was built by the GWR themselves at their famed locomotive shops in Swindon, rolling out of the doors in 1913 and spending most of its career in the Birmingham area, intended as a suburban locomotive on commuter runs, hauling passenger trains with plenty of stops in the city center and the outskirts, usually with relatively small distances between the stations. A boiler pressure of 200 psi, a pair of 17 by 24 inch cylinders, and 68 inch diameter driving wheels came together to give the locomotive a tractive effort of 18,360 pounds. However, as already implied by the punchline at the beginning, this locomotive didn't prove to be very successful, along with a bunch of standard Great Western tank engine issues listed here. And yes, you may pause the video to have a better read. The biggest problem with number 4600 was its big lack of adhesion and acceleration compared to the very class of tank engine that was in production when the one-off Small Atlantic was built, the 4500s, which were very similarly sized 262 Prairies, 75 of which were built between 1906 and 1924. Also designed by Churchward. The GWR had already tried out Prairie tanks, and with nearly 500 of them being built between 1903 and 49, across 7 variants of large Prairies and 3 variants of small Prairies, with the 4500s being the second variant of the small Prairie family, it's fair to say that they had proven to be a great success across the entire GWR system. The 2221s, often nicknamed county tanks, had proven to be borderline useless compared to the various classes of large Prairies, and 4600 was in a similar position compared to the small Prairies. Heck, the 4500s proved good enough that they built another 100 with slightly bigger water tanks, classified as the 4575s. In the end, the 442 Atlantic had been a bit of an oddball for the GWR, mainly because, weirdly enough, the most successful engines were just Atlantic versions of the 2900s and 4000s. Yep, the Saints and Stars, which were 460 10-wheelers. Some of them were intentionally built as Atlantics to see how they would compare in adhesion. And as a tank engine, the Atlantic was just bordering on impractical. Ultimately, number 4600 remained the only small Atlantic the GWR had built, and after 12 years of underperforming in the shadow of the 4500 small Prairies, it was withdrawn from service in 1925 and broken up for scrap shortly after, with the 2221 large Atlantics following nearly a decade later. Number 4. Number 1363. Now on to happier times with an engine that actually made it into preservation. Engine 1363 was part of a much smaller family of 060 tank engines that I personally like to refer to as the Swindon docksiders. Insert jokes about your North American sport of choice: baseball, basketball, ice hockey, padded rugby, etc. The docksiders were a small fleet of 11 locomotives built between 1910 and 1934, numbered 1361 through 1371. And yes, all were built at Swindon. The first 5 of these, all built in 1910, were saddle tanks designed by Churchward and classified as the 1361 class. In terms of tractive effort, they developed 14,835 pounds of it, thanks to their boiler pressure of 150 psi, a pair of 16 by 20 inch cylinders, and 44-inch diameter driving wheels. Due to being saddle tanks, the engines had a more conventional parallel boiler with a round-top firebox and a steam dome housing the regulator or throttle valve, instead of Churchward's usual design of a tapered boiler with a Belpaire firebox and no dome, due to the regulator valve being mounted against the front tube sheet. They operated as switchers, or shunters if you prefer, around various docks at Plymouth Mill Bay, Lara, St. Blaise, and Bridgewater, the railway workshop at Newton Abbot, and Swindon, and even for a brief test on the Weymouth Harbour Tramway right up to their withdrawal from service between 1961 and 62. Engine 1363 became the only docksider of the saddle tank design to survive, being saved in 1964 when the little engine was bought by a bunch of members from the Great Western Society. The locomotive moved under its own steam from Lara, where it was last stationed, to the market town of Taunton on the South Devon Railway, where the locomotive was rebuilt and restored to full operational condition. In 1969, the engine moved to the Society's depot at Bodmin, where she received a new buffer beam fabricated on a submarine depot courtesy of the Royal Navy. And when that depot closed down, she moved again, this time to the old GWR steam shops at Didcot, which would eventually grow out into Didcot Railway Centre. After several years in use and then several years of static display, she's been undergoing an overhaul since 2014. Here's to the hope that the oldest genuine GWR steam locomotive of the Great Western Society will return sooner rather than later, provided they can actually keep their priorities straight and not sacrifice number 7027 Thornbury Castle and turn it into a superfluous star locomotive while passing the boiler to the Night Owl project. But she's not the only docksider to survive into preservation. Number 3. Number 1369. Yes, the other surviving Swindon docksider is one of the 6 additional locomotives built in 1934, once again at Swindon. So with locomotives 1361 through 1365 classified as the 1361 class, the rest, locomotives 1366 through 1371, were classified as the 1366 class, obviously. As you may have noticed, they do look a bit different though. Churchward's successor, Charles Collett, decided to build his own updated and somewhat modernized version of the docksider tank, with a Belpaire firebox which is more standardized for the Great Western, as opposed to the traditional round-top firebox design. And as a result, the saddle tank was replaced with a pair of Pannier tanks. Pannier tanks were essentially a special type of side tanks that were slung over the boiler instead of placed on the frame, resulting in a pretty good compromise between side tanks and saddle tanks. You get the relatively low center of gravity and thus theoretically good stability at higher speeds on a side tank, and some access to the valve gear within the frame like on a saddle tank. Another noteworthy detail of the 1366s compared to the 1361s is that they were actually a little bit more powerful, thanks to a slightly higher boiler pressure of 165 psi. The rest of the tractive effort related geometry was the same on the 1361s, so the extra 15 psi of boiler pressure boosted the tractive effort to 16,320 pounds. But they were basically used in the same places for similar duties, albeit with a bit more use on the Weymouth Harbour Tramway, and engine 1369 and 2 others making a final stand in regular service in the town of Wadebridge, displacing the old London and South Western BT Well tanks on the Bodmin and Wadebridge Railway to Wentford Bridge, until the little Panniers themselves were all retired between 1960 and 1964. Locomotive 1369 became the only Pannier of the docksiders to be preserved. Just like where 1363 first started off, 1369 has stuck around at the South Devon Railway. Perhaps the biggest and funniest claim to fame was when on May 9th of 2017, the final day of its previous boiler ticket, the locomotive was painted up in a different shade of green, more on the malachite side, I suppose, as opposed to Brunswick. The idea was to make it look like the livery of the new Great Western Railway, which was basically just a brand or franchise for all the current mainline services in the west of England. And honestly, the malachite-ish green, the bright banana yellow buffer beam, the road number and the newer GWR logo done up in silver paint on the sides of the cab and water tanks. God, what a phenomenal way to make the purists cry out in agony! This is up there with Taw Valley in purple for the late Queen's 70th anniversary on the throne, or LMS 2085 in Caledonian blue, as one of the best yet most hilarious liveries in British steam locomotive history, at least for preservation. Plus, both 1363 and 1369 score points when it comes to being unique. Though very similar to each other, the 1361s were the only homegrown Great Western saddle tanks, at least as far as I know. And at the time of their construction, the 1366s were the only Pannier tank engines with outside steam cylinders, though they did retain the tradition of having Stephenson's link motion within the frame as their valve gear. Number 2. Number 9466. Ah, there's my boy. As a fun way to shake things up a bit, most of this segment will be a showcase of a Gmod model that I built of this engine. In, well, the video game Garry's Mod, better known as Gmod for short. The first genuinely good steam locomotive that I built on the smaller and more realistically skilled RSG gauge, as opposed to the old and admittedly very wide PHX gauge. But there are still a few pictures of the real engine in here just in case. Now then, this locomotive was built as part of my personal favorite class of Pannier tanks, the 9400s, designed by the GWR's final chief mechanical engineer, or locomotive designer, Frederick Hawksworth. Most people are probably familiar with Collett's 5700s as their Panniers of choice, or his slightly smaller 6400s and Hawksworth's 1600s, which were designated as small Panniers, with the 5700s therefore sort of being medium Panniers. Even if the 1366s were actually smaller, so like what, would they be micro Panniers or mini Panniers? I don't know. Regardless, Hawksworth's 9400s were of a different category. Large Panniers. They were bigger and more distinctive in their shape, with the key factor being their tapered boiler, which was so long that the water tanks didn't reach the very front of the smoke box. Instead, roughly half of the smoke box was actually exposed, a look that I actually prefer as opposed to the water tanks reaching the very front. Because on British tank engines, or any tank engine in general, I like seeing the smoke box portion of the boiler being exposed for all to see. It's just my preference. So if the smoke box is basically covered up where the water tanks reach the very front of the smoke box, no thank you. Or how about that one saddle tank engine called Ugly, where the water tank covers the smoke box, but the firebox is exposed? No wonder it's called Ugly. When it comes to the days of the Big Four though, they were very late to the game. The class totaled 210 locomotives, with a slightly odd but necessary numbering scheme of 9400 through 9499, 8400 through 8499, and 3400 through 3409. But only the first 10 of these were built by the GWR themselves. At Swindon, obviously. And they were built there in 1947. And the remaining 200 locomotives were built by 3 outside contractors: Robert Stephenson and Hawthorne Limited in Darlington, W.G. Bagnall in Stafford, and the Yorkshire Engine Company in Sheffield, rolling out of their doors between 1948 and 56, with 9466 being one of the Stephenson engines built in 1952. So yeah, most of the 9400s only got to serve with the Great Western after it was rebranded into the Western region of the #1 favorite railroad company from Darkness the Curse from History in the Dark, British Railways. You know I had to do that. Anyway, you'd be surprised to hear that the 9400s actually had the same directive effort as all, or at the very least, most of the 5700s. 22,515 pounds. The related geometry for this included a boiler pressure of 200 psi, a pair of 17.5 by 24-inch cylinders, and 55.5-inch diameter driving wheels. The 9400s kind of looked like a tank engine version of the Collet 2251 tender engines, more commonly known as the Collet Goods. And to be fair, both classes actually used the exact same boiler, but apparently it's more fair to call the 9400s a tapered boilered development of the 8750 sub-series of the 5700 class. And despite being panniers, they were surprisingly heavy, weighing in at 56.2 metric tons, which actually restricted their route availability quite a bit. And to think I forgot to mention that those 200 British Rail locomotives didn't have superheaters, and some of the 10 GWR examples were later stripped of theirs. In case you didn't know or you straight up forgot, superheaters were special steam tubes that ran back and forth through the exhaust flues, giving the hot combustion gases from the fire one last opportunity to raise the temperature in the steam before it's fed into the cylinders. Basically, if you had two locomotives of the same class, one with superheaters and one without, the superheated locomotive could have up to 33.3% more horsepower compared to the non-superheated or saturated example. Though apparently, despite the lack of superheaters, the 9400s still managed to see quite a bit of use on various assignments. From short-distance freight trains, to a little bit of passenger service here and there, to the obvious task of switching or shunting. And they were actually fairly well distributed across the entire western region, though obviously restricted to trackage that could actually handle their weight. But yeah, just look at them, the tapered boilers and partially exposed smoke boxes. For a pannier, this is very unique, because like I said, the others had their water tanks reach the very front of the smoke box, which I don't like very much. And of course, most of the other panniers just had conventional parallel boilers with those big Victorian steam domes to house the regulator valve. So therefore, despite their limitations and the lack of superheaters, the 9400s were still a breath of fresh air. Withdrawals started as early as 1959, with the last one going out in 1965. But fortunately, 9466 was saved for preservation. Initially sent to the legendary Wooden Brothers scrapyard in Barry, in Wales, she was bought by Dennis Howells, who I believe was a former British Railways signalman, who lovingly restored the locomotive to working order, completing the necessary repairs in 1985 and pissing off the purists by painting her up in GWR green instead of BR black. The large pannier made a name for herself with visits to various heritage railways, but of course, the most prestigious part of all was that she became one of two pannier tanks to eventually do what very few small tank engines could do in the UK. Run on the main line! Yes, 9466 was certified for running on the British main line system, and was seen hauling passenger trains on rail tours and excursions several times, usually along fellow mainline certified pannier 9600, which is just a more common 5700 design. But whatever. Hell, 9466 even saw some action on the London Underground, or Overground system. And all of this was made even more impressive when you realize that these two little locomotives weren't fitted with air compressors or air brakes. They could just get by with steam and vacuum brakes, because that also happened to be the braking system on the carriages that they pulled. Sadly, their mainline career would end in 2018, when Howells had sadly passed away at the age of 78. Though luckily, fellow steam preservationist Jonathan Jones Pratt was able to buy the locomotive, announcing that he did so in 2019, with the engine seeing service on various heritage lines again before the locomotive's boiler ticket expires at the end of next year. And before you ask, luckily she's not the sole survivor of her class, as the prototype locomotive, 9400, has also been preserved, albeit as a static display piece at the Museum of the Great Western Railway. Guess where that's located? What's that? Yes, indeed! Swindon! How is it even possible? Specifically, the Museum of the GWR is actually located right in the remains of their old locomotive factory. However, as good as number 9466 is, what with it being my favorite Pannier tank because of her slightly different shape by Pannier standards and the mainline career she had in preservation, I don't think she's the most unique Great Western tank engine of the lot, even by Pannier standards. For there is one Great Western tank engine, another Pannier in fact, that's even more unique, rarer, and perhaps in a very weird way, American. Speaking of American, thanks to Gary's mod, we can actually have a Great Western Pannier and a Union Pacific Challenger next to each other. And in case you're going to complain about how this isn't historically accurate whatsoever, at least be happy that I didn't give these locomotives Thomas the Tank Engine faces. Number 1. Number 1501. Yes, coming in at the top we have the sole survivor of the most unique class of Great Western tank engines ever, which was also the final new class of Great Western steam locomotives, period. Hawksworth's other class of large panniers, the 1500s, which were all built at, one last time and all together now, Swindon! Only a single batch of 10 examples had been built, numbered 1500 through 1509, and they didn't come along in time to witness the Great Western Railway as an independent railway company, as they were all built in 1949. So like most of the 9400s, they only saw the GWR as the western region of British Railways. Unlike the other classes of panniers or other tank engines, the 1500s were confined to only one particular part of the western region, the train station at London Paddington, where they shoveled empty coaching stock around the place. They were just as powerful as the 9400s with the same tractive effort related geometry, and thus the same tractive effort, duh, but the 1500s were easily the most distinctive and, dare I say it, rebellious steam locomotives that the Great Western Railway had ever designed, not just by Pannier standards, but also by the standards of the Churchwood Revolution. Although they had the same tapered boiler used on the 9400s, that still made them radically different by Pannier standards, because those two were the only classes of Pannier tanks to use tapered boilers. And then of course there's the biggest hallmark of the 1500s, the fact that they had completely external steam cylinders, with Walshart's piston valve gear, instead of the traditional setup for a Pannier tank, which was to have a pair of inside steam cylinders with Stephenson's link motion within the frame. The water tanks also looked to be a little bit shorter compared to the 9400s, resulting in the entire smoke box portion of the boiler, and even a little bit of the boiler itself, being exposed for all to see. And yet, whereas the 9400s had a water capacity of 1300 imperial gallons, the 1500s apparently had a slightly bigger water capacity of 1350 imperial gallons. Go figure that one out. Basically, the 1500s were Hawksworth's interpretation of the S100s, an American class of 060 tank engines designed for switching operations in Europe, and particularly the United Kingdom, during the Second World War, with similar principles such as the extended, or at least exposed, smoke box, the steam cylinders and Walshart's valve gear on the outside for easy maintenance and lubrication, and a short wheelbase, allowing them to negotiate the tight curves in the tracks of rail yards and various docks, though the S100 still had a shorter wheelbase of 10 feet, compared to the 1500s having a wheelbase of 12 feet and 10 inches. As far as I know, this seems to be the only real area where the 1500s were beaten by their American influencers. Designed by Captain Howard Hill, a guy who used to work on the Southern Pacific Railroad and was drafted into the American military to design some locomotives and other rolling stock for them. Retirement hit the 1500s pretty early, and not just once, but twice. All 10 locomotives were fairly quickly retired from BR's books between 1959 and 63, with locomotives 1501, 1502, and 1509 all being sold to the National Coal Board. They had a second career with them at Coventry Colliery before being retired again in 1970. All 3 locomotives were actually bought by the Severn Valley Railway that same year, but 1501 became the only survivor, whereas the other 2 were used as spare parts before their remains were broken up for scrap, also that same year. Since then, 1501 had become an SVR regular, and her unique, somewhat American-influenced design easily makes her the #1 most unique Great Western tank engine. In preservation, seeing how 4600, the small Atlantic tank, was a one-off that didn't prove to be very successful, and it was broken up long before BR days.
And there you have it, the top 5 most unique Great Western tank engines. This was a pretty fun video to make, actually. I'm happy about how it turned out. So, hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you on Christmas for, again, my final video, Loco Profiling Episode 10, which is sadly going to be much more negative about a particular American locomotive that doesn't deserve the fan base that it ended up building. You'll see what it is when it's time.